if you care about trans rights, which you should care about everybody's human rights. You have to remember that only 9,000 people have ever got these gender recognition certificates anyway. Most trans identifying people do not have them, and everybody has the same human rights. It's very frustrating that we're constantly having this really very pointless discussion about a law that's 20 years old and was passed to solve a problem that doesn't even exist anymore.
There was reports this morning that Labour is planning to make it easier for transgender people to get the certificate that they need to change their legal gender. This comes at a time when the party is already in a very public argument with Harry Potter, author J.K. Rowling, over trans issues. She says Labour has, quote, abandoned women, claiming the party is dismissive, even offensive towards them. Labour's Shadow Health Minister, Wes Streeting, he responded to these comments earlier on Times Radio.
I'm pretty depressed, to be honest. I have a lot of respect for J.K. Rowling, both in terms of what she's done for children and literacy, but also the work that she's done campaigning for women, and in particular violence against women and girls. I think that we've clearly got more work to do to rebuild trust with people that we've lost on this issue. I do think the Labour Party is in a better place. I actually think our national conversation's in a better place than we have been. And I actually do feel very optimistic and hopeful that we can find a way through what has at times been a toxic conversation where women have felt silenced, trans people have felt beaten up by headlines. And I think we can find a way through that both treats trans people with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and also treats women with the respect that they deserve, particularly protecting women's spaces, women's voices, and right to speak up. So when women like J.K. Rowling do speak up, I think it's important we engage seriously with the arguments that she's making, with the concerns that she has. And also we listen to what trans people are saying about the everyday injustices and indignities that they're experiencing too, whether that's hate crime or poor provision in public services.
Well, that was Wes Streeting responding to J.K. Rowling's criticisms of the Labour Party on this particular issue. I guess all the more telling because she has hitherto been a great supporter of the Labour Party and indeed been a major donor of the Labour Party. And yet, despite what Wes Streeting was saying there, Labour shows no inclination to move in her direction. It's working on plans to scrap current rules that require proof that a person has lived in their new gender for 2 years. And rather than the approval of a panel of doctors and lawyers, the situation now, those who want to change their gender under Labour would need just one specialist in the field to approve an application. So what do those who are worried about the elevation of transgender rights over women's rights think of this? I'm joined by campaigner and author Helen Joyce. So let's get her take on these proposals. Helen, thanks for joining us. Let me start with a basic question. And it's this: should trans people be able to change their legal gender?
It's such a difficult question because straight away you ask yourself, what do you mean? I mean, what the Gender Recognition Act does is it allows you to get a birth cert that changes the sex on that. But that doesn't work for every law. It's a complex piece of legislation, and it, for example, doesn't change your sex for the purposes of parenthood or for inheritance, but it does for pensions and it does for marriage. So straight away, there isn't such a thing as changing your legal gender. What I'd say is the right place to start thinking about this is at the Equality Act, not at the Gender Recognition Act.
So as a general proposition, is Labour right to make this self-identification of gender, of changing one's gender, is it right to make it easier?
No, it's the wrong place to start. I mean, where they need to start is with human rights, which is what everybody has. I mean, a trans person who does or doesn't have a gender recognition certificate has the same human rights. It can't depend on whether you've gone to the bother of getting this piece of paperwork. And everybody else has the same human rights too. Everybody has a sex. Some people identify as trans. What are the rights you're trying to protect? That's the right place to start. It's incredibly frustrating, this discussion, because for literally years, women have been saying you're starting in the wrong place. You're starting with this question of legal gender. You should be starting with the human rights, which everybody has and which do depend in some situations on your sex.
It doesn't sound, though, that the politicians are listening to you, certainly not the Labour ones. As I understand it, the current law says you must prove you've been living in your new gender for 2 years by providing documentation to that effect. Labour would take that requirement away, though they still want what they're calling a period of reflection to ensure that those who want a new gender have spent time committed to the idea and take it seriously. What do you make of that?
I mean, this is the third government on these islands. Like, if Labour were to form the next government, it'll be the third government on these islands that has tried to do something like this, because the Conservatives tried to do this in 2018. The SNP government in Scotland tried to do it in 2022. And in both occasions, they realised that it's just much more complicated than they thought. They just weren't thinking about other people. They were only thinking about the people who wanted to do whatever change your legal gender means. So this could easily be the third time that a government tries to do this and then discovers it's more complex than they thought. I wish that people would learn from history. I mean, there's a reason that Theresa May abandoned those proposals. There's a reason that a Section 35 order stopped the SNP from bringing in legal gender self-ID. I mean, what does Labour need to find out? We've tried these things. Does it want to be third time lucky or something?
Interesting. Because the Labour proposal also says, at least we think this is what it's going to say, that one specialist clinician should assess applications for gender recognition certificates, rather than what I understand is that there's currently a panel system of doctors and lawyers. Is that still an appropriate hurdle? Or in your view, I think probably it's just the wrong way to go about it.
I mean, it's the wrong way to go about it, definitely, but also this idea that the current system is in some way degrading or intrusive or asks too much of people is just nonsense. Like, people listening to this probably think that you have to go in front of the panel in person and that maybe they do a medical exam or something like that. None of that is true. It costs £5, which you don't have to pay if you're on a low income. It's paperwork based only. You just send them some bills and such like, showing that you've changed your name from a stereotypical male to female or vice versa, and you've changed your title, and you have to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria that 2 doctors sign. Then the panel looks at you when it meets, which it does regularly, and it approves more than 90%. I mean, if you compare this to getting a disabled parking slot, it's literally easier than that. This is one of the easiest and most efficient, with the highest approval rates, things that anyone does in interaction with the government at all. So this idea that there's some awful process that's an incredible burden on trans people is just not true. If you care about trans rights, which you should care about everybody's human rights. You have to remember that only 9,000 people have ever got these gender recognition certificates anyway. Most trans-identifying people do not have them, and everybody has the same human rights. It's very frustrating that we're constantly having this really very pointless discussion about a law that's 20 years old and was passed to solve a problem that doesn't even exist anymore. I mean, now we've got same-sex marriage, now pensions are at the same age, and now we've got digital identities. All these things mean that this is just the wrong place to start. It's like they're looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
Helen Joyce, we'll leave it there, but thank you for your contribution to that. Very interesting how you responded to that. Helen Joyce there on Labour's potential changes to trans self-identification or trans changing of gender.